his supposed contract clauses are accurate, then the chances of Sergio Perez making out even this season have drastically declined. Now, I'm not downing on Checo specifically for this video. I'm downing more on Christian Horner for making Red Bull look incompetent in its driver choice. When I heard the Red Bull team principal justifying the team's choice to maintain Sergio Perez for not just one more year, but potentially 2, I was left quite confused why he made this decision this early in the year. Instead, Christian Horner only offered the plum of a new contract to Checo to try and see if that would G up the Mexican driver's spirits and get him back to getting podiums and top 5 finishes consistently again. He thought that a contract would make him better. Instead, it's made no difference. And now it's just made the team principal look like he doesn't know what he's talking about in terms of drivers. There's a Yuki Tsunoda who's practically ready to go. And now basically he's been given the task that Pierre Gasly had been given, to run the second team. And when you step back and look at the maths in terms of this season and last season, 2023's campaign for Checo looked really quite rosy. Going from scoring over 100 points in the first 6 races of the year to barely a tenth of that for the following 6, and him falling out of Q1 far too often than is comfortable for what team he's in. If we went back to last year, when Checo was getting maybe seconds and thirds, he had a couple of wins and top 5 finishes, this level of scrutiny toward the Mexican driver I would consider quite harsh. And even then, he was being thought of being replaced that year, that he only had 2 or 3 more races left. But come on, when you compare it to this year, the Sergio Perez of 2023 wasn't all that bad, except for a few races when he did actually have some legitimate howlers like Suzuka and even his home race. And besides, there was no harm in the Constructors' Championship being lost for that team since they were comfortably ahead. It didn't really matter as much. This year, there is no hiding the fact that Sergio Perez is not doing all that well, and he has now scored less points than Nico Hülkenberg. He is the worst performing driver out of any of the front runners, with Nico scoring more than he and Charles Leclerc. And now we're finding ourselves in a similar situation where Red Bull are conducting a test of some sort with their RB20, this time around a filming day, using their current car with one of their non-senior team drivers. And even though Christian Horner is quick to say that, oh no, this test was planned for several months, this wasn't an ad hoc response or anything, and the AlphaTauri test that Liam's doing later on this month, that's the same. Well, that was the case for last year's test. That was planned with Pirelli. So you can't really use that argument, Christian, to try and deflect. The fact of the matter is, though, what happened last year and what we got in the Hungarian Grand Prix, and now we're going to get to the Hungarian Grand Prix next week, you can't help but compare the two. And after watching Drive to Survive and that entire sequence during that test and how quickly a decision was made in regards to De Vries's future, the world is awaiting the outcome of this test. Does this mean that we might get a similar outcome where Sergio Perez is dropped from Red Bull immediately and then has no drive and he's basically forced into retirement? Let's not be too hasty here. There is a very key difference from this year and last year, that being of course Nick De Vries having no real connections to the Red Bull organisation at all, not much in terms of sponsorship or recognition, and of course he was a Mercedes driver, so I thought it was a total mismatch to begin with. But there wasn't really much love lost by dropping Nick and putting him in with Daniel. In fact, in the eyes of Red Bull, it was a win-win, because with Daniel's help, he did get AlphaTauri off the bottom of the constructors, so he did provide them something, as well as some lucrative sponsorship capital going into this year as well, so it was a worthwhile decision, although I do think it was harsh on Nick. He should have been given more time. But when it comes to Sergio, he is far more costly to replace, and he's also far more integrated into the team's structure. Any removal of Checo from the team would come at a fairly huge cost, be it compensation or a loss in sponsorship monies, and a natural abandonment of most of their fan base in the Western Hemisphere. Put simply, Christian has to make a decision. What is worth more to him? The money that Checo brings in from his sponsors and fans, or the money that is lost from Checo's lack of performance in terms of prize money? And we all know how obsessed Christian Horner is with the team championship. He's looking at potentially a hat-trick of Constructors' Championships, and now that could be lost. A hat-trick! It's a genuine concern for Red Bull too, not just Horner, because they were going from scoring over 30 points on average per 4-race chunk in the opening act of this year, and being well ahead of Ferrari, to now scoring just over 20 points on average per 4-race chunk, and behind McLaren and Mercedes. and they're only spared 4th in the statistic given Ferrari's fall-off being even more spectacular. Red Bull is a one-man band because Checo is not really pulling his weight, and that's not down to just a lack of skill, because Checo in of himself is a good driver. He is a really good driver on his day. It's just simply down to the fact that luck has really not been supporting him, and also the pressure has been mounting. We've seen that with countless previous teammates to Max Verstappen, and simply it's down to qualifying. Checo just cannot get it done in qualifying. On Saturday, he's just not there. Either down to a mistake or poor timing on the team's part, his side of the garage. That's the thing to take into account as well. There's Max's side of the garage and there's Checo's side of the garage. In terms of timing, whether it's track evolution or traffic, it has resulted in either Checo not getting through to Q3 or not even making it into Q2. There have been some really unfortunate circumstances, which has made Checo's Sunday all the harder, because as we saw with Mercedes in their dominant era, if they found themselves behind cars, their cooling really suffered. They were used to being at the front. Red Bull is used to being at the front. So trying to get past different cars, if you're not Max Verstappen, it's going to be really tricky because the car might overheat as well. That's something to consider. And with the nature of F1 grids being what they are, it does make it harder for you to get back to the front, because a Q1 exit can lead to Checo being a pit stop's worth of time behind Max within 5 to 10 laps, and eliminating any chance of him of scoring meaningful points unless there's a huge accident at the front. Now, every time I've talked about Checo and him staying at Red Bull, I do have to point out that I have to congratulate his team for even getting a contract across the line, and this early in the season. Them being able to come up with a way of keeping Sergio Perez at Red Bull for yet another year or two, given the fact that right now and last year he was struggling hard. He was able to make up the difference at the end of the season, and him being able to do the deed when the team is clearly revolving around Max, and it really helps that Max Verstappen basically doesn't really care who his teammate is. So in terms of Perez staying around, if Max was like, no, I don't want him there, get rid of him, he would be gone. But right now Max is just like, whatever. But the biggest thing that supported Checo getting that contract is that he remained loyal to the boss. Red Bull Racing is Christian Horner's team for all bar a few weeks at the beginning, after Dietrich Mateschitz bought the team in 2004. Be nice to the boss, and the boss will be nice to you. He will have your back. And given what was happening with Christian Horner, when he looked like he could realistically lose the team that he had helped foster for 2 decades, he didn't really get any blowback from Checo whatsoever. He remained quiet throughout the entire thing. It worked out for Checo initially, since the boss was able to weather the storm of allegations and internal struggles, at least for now, and that meant when things were going well for Checo, the boss would be praising him to the heavens. And even when things weren't going so great, such as in Melbourne, the leader would immediately and vocally state that the car let Perez down on the day, and it had nothing to do with his skills. At that time, Ferrari were the only real challenger for Red Bull, and they still had some ways to go to improve their lot. McLaren themselves weren't getting off to the best start that they could have had at the beginning before the Miami upgrades, and Mercedes, well, they were busy fending off Aston Martin at the time. Fast forward to now though, you don't hear Christian Horner championing his second driver anymore. You hear a more concerned tone and soundbites suggesting that Checo needs to step up and break this unsustainable run of results, which could have been even worse after Silverstone had McLaren sustained a 1-2 finish and taken potentially a nigh on 30-point chunk out of Red Bull's lead in the constructors. All because Checo made a mistake at the same corner that Max Verstappen went off at as well, and that meant that he was consigned to the back and becoming a guinea pig in regards to when it was right to go to the inter tyres, which meant that Max could then time it right, and then ultimately he could then get back to second place. Checo did his service, but I think the team would ideally want him up there with the other drivers so he could play silly buggers when it comes to Mercedes and McLaren, and even Ferrari. And I think what makes Christian Horner's lot even more tricky is that the RB20 is simply not as good as the RB19. Now, granted, it'd be nigh on impossible to produce a car that was even better and even more dominant than the RB19, but you'd think that Red Bull would like to produce something that was close enough that it would still be leagues ahead of everybody else, or there was some wiggle room, but there isn't anymore. The competition has caught up, and next year it's going to be even closer. Max is having to outdrive the car to get anywhere near the front, try harder than he has done since the first half of 2022, when the RB18 was dealing with weight issues and reliability concerns whilst Ferrari was singing. Until they suffered from reliability concerns. Max Verstappen is saying that he is having to drive that car at 101% more often than is comfortable, so naturally that is going to cause him to make a few more mistakes than he would have done had he been able to have some wiggle room with the car, like he did with the RB18 and 19. And therefore we are seeing him going all out, driving out of his skin and really showcasing the talents that the Dutchman has inherently, that he has been able to foster since he started his karting career. And it really then makes the difference between he and his teammate all the more stark. And this is something that Alex Albon has been talking about in every single interview that he can, that when he saw Max getting faster in the car and really coming into his own with that vehicle, it meant that he had to pull his socks up even more just to keep up. And that in turn would mean that he would reach the ceiling of his own talents. This is what happens when you get the difference between a good driver and a great driver. When that great driver can step up, the good driver might be left in their wake. Sort of like what happened when Lewis Hamilton and Heikki Kovalainen were teammates at McLaren. Kovalainen says that as Lewis would continue to improve and get that little bit faster in every session, he himself would have to go beyond the limitations in his own skill set, which would in turn lead to mistakes and thusly falling short of getting anywhere near the Brit. I feel really bad for Kovalainen. Nobody really talks about him. Even Lewis sometimes forgets to mention him when discussing previous teammates. Well, Kovalainen wasn't a terrible driver in Formula 1. He was decent. He was good. I mean, why would McLaren hire him if he wasn't? He just simply was not good enough to be right there next to Lewis when they would need him in the constructors. And therefore, he did get the sack. And especially when you consider that the guy who replaced him was the guy who'd won the championship the year before. I'm sorry, Heikki. You might have been able to stave off many drivers on the grid, but not Jenson Button. No. Come on, a British team having two British drivers. Yeah, the British bias would be really strong with that one. Ultimately, he just lacked the thing that would make him into a great driver. Him mentioning that in his case, it was his inability to drive well with a car that lacked aerodynamic grip, which Lewis could work with far more often. That, and he jokingly suspected that Lewis had some special sensors in his bottom. Well, that's one way to describe it, Heikki. Last year, when the RB19 was almighty and Checo was either second or third in the title, his performances could be swatted away by the management and paid no mind to, even though the criticism from overseas and beyond was quite heavy. It didn't really matter as much because Max was carrying the team. They were going to win the constructors no matter what. He was winning it by himself. Getting the 1-2 thing, it's a luxury thing to have. It'd be nice. It's something that Red Bull had never done before, so that was a thing that had been unlocked in terms of achievements for Christian Horner, because Checo had done something that no other Red Bull driver had been able to do. Not even Mark Webber. Not even Daniel Ricciardo. But now things have changed considerably, because instead of being in the top 3 in the driver's standings, Checo is currently 6th. Piastri overtaking him, and George might have overtaken him at Silverstone as well, had his car decided not to have an issue with its water pumps, and therefore they had to retire the car. And Lewis now is only 8 points behind Checo, so it could get even worse. And this is when certain contract clauses, which have suddenly come to light, supposedly, might come into play here, which could mean that Red Bull could terminate him without any real meaningful penalty. Well, except in terms of merchandise and recognition from the Western Hemisphere, like I mentioned. He has a clause that means that if at a certain point in the season he is more than 100 points behind Max Verstappen, or he's behind Max Verstappen by 5 places in the Drivers' Championship, Red Bull can look into that contract and then just tear it up. And right now, it's not looking good, because Checo is now almost 140 points behind Max Verstappen halfway through the season, and if it goes the way it's going right now, by the time we get to the summer break, he could be 7 places behind Max Verstappen in the championship. So, yeah, this just makes the last contract clause that came out last year of him getting a pay cut after a certain spread of points was reached, yeah, that pales in comparison. And that's only going to get worse with Mercedes now back in the game, continuing their hyper-aggressive upgrade path like a team possessed. And that means that Red Bull are probably starting to get a little bit hot under the collar. Now, okay, sure, this doesn't really affect Max Verstappen at all. The team is built around him. He is able to get the most out of that car, driving beyond its limits, and he is probably going to get that 4th Drivers' Championship, because right now, he is over 80 points ahead of Lando Norris, and barring a hugely disappointing run of reliability, he's got it right now, and he's still the favourite to get his 5th world title in a row in 2025. But right now, in terms of the constructors, Red Bull might not be as rosy as they were last year, and they could fall as low as 3rd if McLaren improve their strategy game, and Mercedes continue their upgrades, and then proving to be quite successful. And then, of course, having a re-energized Lewis Hamilton, him rediscovering his game after years of struggling and in the wilderness, and that might drag George Russell along, thinking that, oh, well, this is great because, this is my team next year, and Lewis is doing well, so I can do well too because I beat him in the last couple of seasons. Yeah, pip, pip, tarry ho, yeah, come on. Something does does need to change, and that might be at the cost of Sergio Perez. I want him to rediscover his mojo. I feel like he can, because we need to look back at his history. He is not a bad driver. He is a good driver, a really good driver. You don't win that Sakir Grand Prix from the back and get to the front for nothing. That team synergy he had, him being able to make the most out of the car, when the car is right behind him, he can make it dance. The fact is, though, that car is not with him. And that is something that Pierre Gasly has mentioned in interviews, saying that something is missing when it comes to the spark of Sergio Perez. Because he said, and we'll get to this quote in a moment, that Checo is just lacking that little bit extra. Ahem. He doesn't seem to get things together, whether it's himself or coming from the team. I don't know and can't really comment on that. Ultimately, his problem at the moment is that he doesn't feel the car. Whenever you feel strong with a car you have for whatever reason, an off weekend, next weekend you come back, you feel good, you put the strong lads in, and you don't even think about it. But he just doesn't seem to be able to get the performance out of it. Whether it's coming from him or the team, I don't know. But there's clearly something that is missing at the moment between the two. What Gasly is trying to say here is that if you have a bad weekend and can't explain why it was such, and the car isn't working with you, it's a compounding effect. It's natural, and it will snowball into something which could ultimately be too much to overcome without intervention or a change in your favour. Because the reasons why they kept him around, Christian Horner, for 2025 and 2026, they no longer apply. The idea of stability and continuity, well, they can't do that anymore. They can't sit on their laurels. They can't just keep things the same, maintain the status quo, because right now, that is going to lose them the team title. And that team really, really values it. Yeah, for us, it's not particularly sexy. It's not like a driver's title. It doesn't really mean much. It wasn't around when Formula One started. It only came around in the late 50s. Amongst the team, gaining that team championship and doing better than the team that is your rival, that matters a lot. And especially when it comes with, nearly 7 figures attached to it. Maybe even 8. And the fact of the matter is that if McLaren are able to give Norris a car where he can start eating into Max's lead in the championship this year or even next, Perez needs to be right up there to stop their rivals, which he isn't doing at the back of the grid or fighting his way through the midfield. So realistically, the onus is on Red Bull as well to provide a car which can maximise the potential of Sergio Perez. But they are really limited in that regard, because that is Max Verstappen's team. The Verstappen organisation have the Red Bull organisation around their little finger. Well, okay, this finger, little finger, there you go. And that's been around for years, and there have been many contract clauses and conditions back when Red Bull weren't so competitive that if they weren't really doing well, then they could leave. Max could go to another team. And these rumours about Max going to Mercedes, they just will not go away. And now that Mercedes are really improving, and they're improving at a rapid rate, like McLaren did last year, that's just going to get even louder. And Max is probably going to look at it and go like, okay. Yeah, he might not do it. He will stick around probably. He doesn't really seem that kind of guy who would just abandon a team at the moment, but things could change rapidly. Much like how the long-term future of Sergio Perez at Red Bull has changed quite drastically in just the span of a few weeks. But at the same time, Perez should be praised for being able to stick it out alongside Verstappen for so long. Gasly could only manage half a season alongside him, and Albon about 18 months. Checo has managed to stick it out for nigh on 3 years at this point, the longest stint any teammate of Verstappen's has been able to endure. So there has to be something there in terms of his skills and being able to hold his own. It must have really affected him. It must have taken his toll, and now it's just simply falling away. The fact of the matter is, though, is that the pressure is mounting, and Christian Horner simply doesn't have any defensive juice left to give to Checo to protect him, like Checo protected Christian during all of those allegations at the beginning of the year. He just simply can't pay it back anymore. Then you've got to take into consideration what's going on the other existential crisis of Red Bull, outside of the turmoil between Christian, Jos and Helmut. What's going on with their junior program? There's been no junior driver in the car for a full-time drive since Yuki in 2021, and that was mainly aided by Honda backing them. I'm not saying that Yuki was gifted the role, he did really well in F2, but Honda and Red Bull being so close at the time gave Tsunoda the leg up over Liam Lawson. Over the last few years, the program's just been like some vestigial tale, one of the real reminders to any junior driver that if you want to get into Formula One, good luck. Either you got to take up a reserve role like Felipe Drugovich has done, or you got to try your luck in IndyCar and then maybe hope for the best, because there are quite a few F2 drivers in IndyCar and they're doing fairly well actually. And right now, during this filming day, Liam Lawson is trying to show Red Bull what he can ultimately do in the senior car. And they really need to think about what they're going to do with Liam, because contractually, if they don't give Liam Lawson a Red Bull car to drive in 2025, then he is contractually free to look at another team elsewhere without any penalty or any blowback from Red Bull, because they didn't hold up their end of the bargain. And I could easily argue that Sergio Perez being hired by Red Bull did put in a cork in terms of the junior program's natural progression, Yuki Tsunoda being the only junior driver as of late to even get in or even have a chance at it. If you remove that cork again, sorry, this is just reality, it might allow the junior program to get back on its feet and start really bringing in drivers again. Because you got Isaac Hadjar in F2, you got Jack Crawford there as well, you got Arvid Lindblad in Formula 3 doing quite well, right up there in the championship. These drivers could get the opportunity to drive for Racing Bulls in a couple of years. If the progression happens, Yuki Tsunoda remains at Racing Bulls or he goes elsewhere, Daniel Ricciardo gets promoted to Red Bull, and then Liam Lawson leaves the Racing Bulls team, allowing another junior driver, probably at the moment Isaac Hadjar, to then take up the role. But yeah, he didn't really introduce himself well, Hadjar, in an FP1 session, because he almost took out Norris and he was like 19th or something. But it does give their F2 drivers some hope that a place for them could be a reality, instead of having to rely on something else or another series to give them any meaningful progression. Look, I want Yuki to get the opportunity to drive alongside Max. Heck, I wouldn't even mind the chaos and unpredictability of Liam being in that car next to Verstappen. But we all know what's going to happen. Daniel Ricciardo is going to get that role because he is a known quantity. He is a supporter of Christian Horner, and Max and he have worked together before, and things have changed since 2018. Daniel is heading toward the end of his career, whereas Max is still at the peak of his career, and he will be there for several years. So Daniel, it's a different dynamic, but it's one that Red Bull has a clue about. And besides, he's a sponsor magnet as well, which could make up the difference lost from Checo sponsors departing the team, and his fans probably finding new uses for their Red Bull merch, which are probably not that gracious. I mean, they could take a punt with Carlos Sainz perhaps, because he is still available. His dithering might have actually proven worthwhile, because Red Bull and Mercedes, they're still open because Kimi Antonelli's not really performing as well as expected, even though he did get a sprint win at Silverstone. And maybe he was told something by Helmut Marko regarding Checo's contract, that it might not have been as stable as it publicly looks, that there might be some wiggle room, and that if these clauses are met and Red Bull could terminate him, there might be room for Carlos after all. But yeah, given the fact that Christian Horner's now taking up contract negotiations, does he really want a round two of Verstappen and Sainz at the same team, even though it is becoming quite clear that you need to have some sort of really solid driver lineup at the front, because McLaren are on it, Mercedes are on it, Ferrari might get back on it eventually if Lewis Hamilton comes over and is able to energize Leclerc, and Lewis feels good in himself. They need two good drivers. Maybe the one driver who's good and then there's an also-ran, that's not working anymore. Things need to evolve, and Red Bull needs to evolve as well. So maybe they might need to bring in Carlos. And that's something I discuss in full in this video here that you can go and watch right now. Carlos Sainz, more like Chaos Sainz, am I right? Am I right?